January 6, 1934, enigmatic public enemy Handsome Jack Klutas knocks on the door of what he believes is a safe house and receives a machine gun salutation from Illinois State Police. Because Klutas attended the University of Illinois as a young man, his gang will become known as the College Kidnappers, although Klutas was probably the only one who attained a higher education, let alone graduated high school. One of the main reasons that Klutas is such a mysterious character is because, whereas the other public enemies of the period, guys like Pretty Boy Floyd, John Dillinger and Machine Gun Kelly were gathering headlines for bank robberies and kidnappings of prominent citizens, Klutas was mainly preying on underworld sorts. Snatching guys who didn't want any attention brought to their situation, be it the police or the press. On the books, Klutas never should have been a criminal. He was born into a respectable family and grew up in Sterling, Illinois, located between Chicago and the Iowa border, where he was a high school athlete and considered a popular kid. Unlike the majority of gangsters, he attended college up until 1923. By the summer of 1924, he had ventured south to the city of Peoria, where he became involved with local bootleggers. It was here that he was arrested when he was caught working what was described as the largest still ever found in that city. He was released pending trial. The mid-20s saw Klutas, already called Handsome Jack by this time, facing more serious trouble. In May, his hometown paper reported that he had been arrested for acting as a fence for loot stolen from numerous freight trains. The following month they reported that their wayward son had been once again arrested in Peoria for auto theft. By the end of June 1925, Klutas had 3 charges against him. Klutas was hit with his first murder charge the following year when on February 27, a fight broke out at a speakeasy and Klutas's friend shot and killed another man. His friend got away, but Klutas surrendered and was held as an accomplice. Nothing came of this charge, nor the charges the previous year for auto theft and fencing the stolen merchandise. In May of 1926, however, he did have to answer for running the still and ended up serving a year in prison. Once out of prison, Klutas returned to Peoria and the criminal life. On July 8, 1927, he returned close to home where a motorcycle cop west of Sterling gave chase to a speeding auto. The chase was short as somebody in the car opened fire and blew out the motorcycle's headlight and pierced the gas tank, draining the officer's fuel. After being arraigned in the Peoria courthouse in February of 1929 for stealing cars, Klutas was arrested by a U.S. Marshal for transporting stolen automobiles across state lines. What made this arrest noteworthy at the time was the fact that the government agent was a woman. Handsome Jack went away with the woman in cuffs but was released on bond. A robbery that would later be credited to Klutas took place in Peoria on March 29, 1930. 2 employees of the Stein Tobacco Company were driving back to the plant with the company payroll of $7,000 when a car pulled up alongside them and a shotgun was shoved through the window with a demand for the money. The sacks of cash were handed over and the bandits took off. As 1930 rolled on, Klutas was still primarily stealing automobiles. 2 of his accomplices were James Clark and Walter Dietrich. On June 16, Klutas and Clark were pulled over in Burlington, Iowa by motorcycle cop George Heckenberg. They drew guns on the officer and forced him into their car. Officer Heckenberg was forced to lie on the rear floor while one of the men sat in the back seat with a gun pointed at his head. Several hours later, as the Desperados neared Des Moines, they released Heckenberg, even returning his gun to him minus the bullets. The following Sunday night, June 22, 3 men robbed the Capitol Theater in Ottumwa. 4 days later, at approximately 2 a.m., Sheriff Fred Sweet, of the small town of Washington, about an hour northeast of Ottumwa, received a call. He was told to be on the lookout for a stolen Buick heading his way. Earlier, a witness saw 3 men roll the Buick out of a garage. One of them, later identified as Klutas, drove off in the stolen vehicle. The other 2, subsequently ID'd as Clark and Dietrich, drove off in the other car. After the phone call, Sheriff Sweet grabbed his marshal, Aaron Bailey, and set up a roadblock outside of town. A few hours later the Buick pulled up. Klutas laid on the charm, setting the two lawmen at ease. They informed Klutas that he had to go into town with them while they checked out his car. Klutas acquiesced and rode into town with the sheriff while Bailey drove the Buick. Since Klutas submitted without hassle, the lawmen made two fatal mistakes. They didn't frisk him and they didn't cuff him. Back at the office, Sheriff Sweet asked the night watchman Bill Bailey, no relation to the marshal, to get the vehicle identification numbers from the Buick while the two lawmen sat with Klutas. Afterwards, Sweet called the sheriff in Ottumwa, and it was determined that Klutas was in fact the car thief. Only then did Sheriff Sweet decide to frisk the bandit. "Let's see what you've got on you," Sweet said as he started to pat down Klutas. Like a flash, Klutas was up and had the sheriff in a headlock with one arm and had a pistol out with the other. Using the sheriff as a human shield, he fired into Marshal Bailey, killing him. Then he turned the gun into the sheriff and murdered him with 3 shots. After a quick firefight with the night watchman, Klutas managed to escape. Despite posses containing over 300 men and 2 airplanes, Klutas made a clean getaway. Later that summer, Klutas moved into a new line of work where he wouldn't necessarily have to deal with law enforcement. Kidnapping underworld sorts and shaking down gambling joints and speakeasies, the victims of which wouldn't go to the police or press. It's not known exactly how Klutas began this line of work. One paper suggested that his penchant for preying on the underworld was the result of a joke. The story went that while in a Peoria speakeasy, as a comical stunt, Klutas walked up to the proprietor and snarled, "We're supervising these joints now, cough up." To his surprise, the proprietor handed over $200 without a fuss. Klutas and his gang made some big scores preying on gamblers and other underworld sorts for the remainder of 1930. The year ended on a bad note for his Confederates James Clark and Walter Dietrich, who were arrested for their part in a bank robbery and murder and sentenced to life. Thus far, Klutas still hadn't been identified as the killer of Sheriff Sweet and Marshal Bailey, nor had he been linked with several other jobs and shootings that would soon be credited to him. Things started to get hot for Klutas in June of 1931, just after the release of a gambler from Blue Island, Illinois, for which a reported $75,000 had been paid. Around this time, a wanted circular was released in Iowa accusing Klutas as one of the men who had kidnapped motorcycle cop Heckenberg the previous year. 2 months later, Klutas was identified as the killer of Sheriff Sweet and Marshal Bailey. Not so coincidental. Just as a number of jobs were being laid at Klutas's door, Peoria gangster Earl Ogden, who had ties with Klutas, was pardoned from his sentence at Leavenworth Prison to assist authorities in the capture of Klutas. Obviously, Ogden had made a deal with authorities and told them about Klutas's exploits going back to the 1927 shooting involving the motorcycle cop outside of Sterling who had his headlight blown out and gas tank perforated. Despite being wanted by both the law and the underworld, Klutas managed to operate successfully for another 2 years. The beginning of the end started in June of 1933 when the gang kidnapped a gambler for the second time in 2 years. Upon his release, the gambler hired a former Chicago crime investigator and now private detective Pat Roche to track them down. After 5 months, he managed to arrest 3 of them at a house on about November 5th. One of those arrested, Julian Babe Jones, cut a deal for himself and spilled the beans on the gang. About a week after the arrests, Peoria detectives Fred Montgomery and Robert Moran cruised by a barbershop that gang member Russell Hughes used as a hangout. From their car, the detectives saw the gangster loitering out front. Hughes also saw the detectives and headed into the shop. The lawmen ran in and a gunfight ensued. Both detectives were wounded in the shootout, Moran fatally, and Hughes died on the spot. After the death of Hughes, the net started to close in on Klutas. Authorities learned that Klutas had undergone plastic surgery in an attempt to change both his looks and his fingerprints. Around Christmas time, the gangster was traced to a house in the Chicago suburb of Bellwood. Ironically, the house was right across the street from Bellwood's chief of police. Teams of men took turns staking out the house. On Saturday, January 6th, detectives decided to raid the house at 1:30 that afternoon. Bursting inside, they found two men, neither of which was Klutas. Though the main target wasn't there, they were happy with one of those captured. A check of fingerprints showed that one of the men in the house was Walter Dietrich, who had escaped from prison the previous September along with numerous members of what quickly became the Dillinger Gang. Dietrich and his confederate were hauled off to police headquarters while the lawmen waited inside the house. About 4 hours later, a car pulled up and Klutas got out. A detective wielding a Thompson machine gun took up a position behind the front door as Klutas strolled up the steps and made his approach. The gangster knocked. A detective pulled the door open and identified himself. Klutas went for his pocket as a burst from the Tommy gun blew him off the porch. The College Kidnappers' body rolled onto the lawn, bringing the curtain down on one of the Public Enemy era's most mysterious characters.